Inside the iron nursery, the echoing shrieks were anything but human. They were the feral, bone-chilling cries of the Alpha King's twin pups. While noble women fled in tears, veteran warriors bled from tiny razor-sharp fangs. The kingdom teetered on the edge of collapse, until an outcast scullery maid, reeking of lye, finally stepped over the bloodied threshold. The year was 1482, and the great stone fortress of Ethelgard Keep was a place suffocated by mourning and raw, unbridled terror. King Cedric Vane, ruler of the formidable Ironwood Pack, had built his reign on blood steel and a terrifyingly dominant wolf. He was a king who had united the northern territories by the edge of his broadsword. Yet the man who sat upon the wolf-pelt throne was entirely broken. 3 years ago, his beloved Lunar Queen Arabella perished giving birth to their heirs. Her death shattered Cedric's soul, driving his wolf deep into the recesses of his mind, leaving behind a cold, distant monarch who ruled through sheer mechanical duty. But the true crisis of Ethelgard was not the king's depression. It was the heirs themselves. The twins Arthur and Leon were born with a concentration of pure alpha blood, so potent it was practically poisonous. Without the vital soothing presence of their mother's scent to anchor them, the boys were trapped in a perpetual state of sensory overload and feral panic. In werewolf lore, a pup should not experience their first shift until their 13th winter. Arthur and Leon shifted at 3. They were terrors wrapped in human flesh and golden fur. They did not speak. They communicated in guttural snarls and defensive barks. They did not walk. They prowled the heavy oak corridors of the keep on all fours, their eyes glowing with an unnatural, untamed amber light. The castle staff lived in absolute dread of the tiny princes. The kingdom's elite had tried and failed spectacularly to tame the boys. Highborn ladies from neighboring territories, eager to secure their place as the new Queen of Ironwood, attempted to play the maternal savior. Lady Amelie of Cornwall, draped in heavy silks and smelling of expensive rosewater, had tried to corner Leon with a wooden toy knight. The pup had lunged, shredding her gown and fracturing her forearm with a bite force that defied his small size. Meister Gregory the royal healer had confidently prescribed sleeping draughts laced with valerian root and microdoses of wolfsbane. The twins, smelling the bitter poison, shattered the glass vials against the stone floor and savaged the Meister's hand so viciously he lost 2 fingers. The alpha pups were entirely consumed by their defensive instincts. To them everyone was a threat. Everyone was an enemy. Ethelgard was plunging into political instability. Whispers spread through the neighboring packs that King Cedric's bloodline was cursed, that mad wolves could never rule the north. In the damp, soot-stained bowels of the keep, far removed from the political machinations of the High Lords, existed Maid Gallagher. Maeve was an Omega, but in a society that revered Omegas as the sweet, submissive peacekeepers of a pack, she was considered an absolute failure. Most Omegas emitted scents of vanilla-warm honey or sweet milk aromas designed by nature to pacify dominating alphas. Maeve's scent was sharp-smelling of bruised pine needles, petrichor, and damp earth. It wasn't sweet. It was grounded. 2 years prior, her former Alpha Lord Harrington of the southern marshlands had publicly rejected her. Standing before their entire pack, Harrington had declared her defective, claiming her presence made the pack uneasy rather than calm. Stripped of her pack, standing and cast out, Maeve had wandered north, grateful just to find employment in the Ethelgard scullery. She was a ghost in the castle. Clad in rough-spun wool, her hands constantly raw from lye and scalding water, she spent her days scrubbing the great hearths and washing the blood off the cobblestones left behind by the feral princes. Maeve knew better than to look the highborn wolves in the eye. She kept her head down, her unruly auburn hair tied back under a soiled linen cap, completely invisible to King Cedric and his royal court. But while the noble women and hardened warriors saw the twin pups as monsters, Maeve, watching from the shadows of the servants' corridors, heard something entirely different in their terrifying roars. She heard the profound, agonizing grief of children who were completely and utterly alone in the dark. The breaking point arrived on the night of the hunter's moon. The atmospheric pressure plummeted, and a violent autumn storm battered the stained glass windows of Ethelgard Keep. The pull of the moon sent the twins' wolves into a complete frenzy. They had barricaded themselves inside the king's solar at the top of the high tower. The heavy oak doors shuddered as the sounds of smashing wood, tearing tapestries, and feral distressed howling echoed down the spiral staircase. Outside, the doors stood King Cedric, his broad shoulders slumped in absolute defeat, his face pale and drawn. Beside him stood Commander Duncan, a heavily scarred beta who served as the king's right hand. "My king, we have no other choice," Duncan urged, his voice tight with regret, as he held up a pair of heavy iron-forged shackles lined with pure silver. "If they breach the window, they will fall to the courtyard below. If they break out into the castle, they will kill a servant tonight. The moon has driven them mad. We must chain them until the cycle passes." Cedric stared at the silver chains. Silver burned a werewolf's flesh. To chain his own 3-year-old sons with the metal of their enemies was an unthinkable cruelty, a trauma that could permanently sever their minds from their humanity. Cedric rubbed his face, a dry sob escaping his throat. "They are my sons, Duncan, not rabid dogs." "Tonight, sire, they are both," the beta replied grimly. Neither man noticed the scullery maid making her way up the dimly lit corridor. Maeve had been assigned the night shift to clean the upper halls. She carried a heavy wooden bucket filled with steaming hot water, harsh yellow lye soap, and a thick handful of crushed rosemary lavender and cold fireplace ash, a cleaning mixture her late mother had taught her to use to lift stubborn grease from stone. As she approached the landing, she felt the oppressive, suffocating aura of alpha distress radiating through the wood of the doors. It made her omega instincts scream. The guards stationed at the stairwell, Richard and Odo, were pale, clutching their spears, completely focused on the king's despair. Maeve didn't stop to ask for permission. Driven by an ancient, overriding instinct that bypassed her fear, she simply walked past the arguing king and his beta. Before Duncan could even register her presence to shout a warning, Maeve pushed her shoulder against the heavy oak door, slipping through the gap and clicking the lock shut behind her. Inside the solar was a war zone. Velvet curtains hung in ribbons. The massive mahogany desk was splintered. Feathers from gutted pillows drifted through the air like a macabre snowfall. Backed into the far corner, illuminated only by the flashes of lightning outside, were Arthur and Leon. They were half-shifted. Their faces were distorted jaws, elongated claws digging deep into the expensive Persian rugs. The moment Maeve entered, 4 glowing amber eyes locked onto her. A dual, deafening growl vibrated through the floorboards, rattling Maeve's teeth. Any other wolf would have reacted to the threat. A dominant wolf would have flashed their eyes and bared their fangs to establish hierarchy. A traditional omega would have dropped to the floor, baring their neck in total submission, pleading for mercy. Both reactions were triggers. Dominance bred a fight. Submission bred the instinct to hunt prey. Maeve did neither. She completely ignored their posturing. Keeping her breathing slow and steady, she walked to the center of the ruined room. The twins tensed, ready to spring and tear her throat out. Instead of approaching them, Maeve dropped to her knees, dipped her rough bristle brush into her wooden bucket and began to aggressively scrub the floor. Scrub, scrub, scrub. The harsh, rhythmic sound cut sharply through the chaotic ringing in the pup's ears. It was a mundane, confusing sound. Then came the scent. As the hot water hit the stones, the cold fireplace ash within the bucket immediately neutralized the heavy metallic stench of fear and blood that had saturated the room. Beneath the ash, the crushed rosemary and lavender bloomed in the damp air. It wasn't the sickly sweet perfume of the noble women. It was sharp grounding and earthy. It smelled like the forest floor after a heavy rain. It smelled like safety. Leon, the slightly larger of the two, crept forward, his claws clicking on the damp stone. He snapped his jaws inches from Maeve's arm, a warning bite intended to terrify her. Maeve didn't flinch. Without looking up, she casually reached out with a soaking, wet, soapy rag and firmly pushed the prince's wet snout away. "Mind the wet floor, little lord, I've only just started," she muttered, her tone entirely devoid of fear, reverence, or submission. It was the exasperated grounding tone of a tired working woman. The sheer, unprecedented audacity of the act caused Leon's wolf to short-circuit. No one touched them casually. People either fought them or fled. To be swatted away like a nuisance, rather than a monster, broke the feral loop in his brain. He blinked, the glowing amber in his eyes flickering. Maeve didn't press the advantage. She went back to scrubbing. As she worked, she began to hum. It wasn't a royal lullaby. It was an old rhythmic working tune from the southern marshes, a low, thrumming vibration in her chest that resonated with the frequency of a wolf's heartbeat. Arthur crept forward, next, drawn by the steam and the scent of pine and rain radiating from Maeve's skin. He sniffed her raw red hands. The harsh lie stung his sensitive nose, pulling him further out of his sensory overload. He let out a confused whine, the first sound he had made all year. That wasn't a snarl. Slowly, carefully, Maeve wrung out the warm, herb-soaked rag. She didn't reach for them. She simply laid the warm cloth on the floor beside her bucket and continued to hum her deep, steady tune. Outside the door, King Cedric had finally gathered his resolve. Gripping the silver chains, he threw his shoulder against the oak doors, bursting into the solar, with Commander Duncan, hot on his heels, ready to subdue the monsters. Cedric froze. The heavy silver chains slipped from his trembling hands, clattering loudly against the stone. The room was destroyed, but it was dead silent. The oppressive aura of feral panic was gone, replaced by the soothing scent of rosemary and ash. In the center of the ruins, the scullery maid was sitting back on her heels. Curled in her lap, utterly exhausted, and completely shifted back into their human forms, were the twin princes of Ethelgard. Arthur had his thumb in his mouth, his face pressed against Maeve's coarse wool apron, while Leon was fast asleep, his small hand gripping the fabric of her dress. Maeve looked up at the Alpha King, her eyes wide with sudden realization of the hierarchy she had just broken, terrified that she was about to be executed for daring to touch the royal bloodline. But King Cedric wasn't looking at her with fury. He was staring at her, as if she had just pulled the sun from the sky. King Cedric Vane did not execute the scullery maid. Instead, to the absolute horror of the Ironwood Pack's noble court, he elevated her. By sunrise, Maeve Gallagher was relocated from the damp, soot-stained bowels of the servants' quarters to a sunlit suite in the royal wing directly adjacent to the king's solar. Cedric's orders were absolute. Maeve was to be the twins' exclusive caretaker. No lord, lady, or meister was permitted to enter the nursery without her explicit consent. The political fallout was immediate and venomous. Ethelgard Keep buzzed with scandal. The highborn elites, led by the ruthless Duke Harrison Montgomery and the cunning Lady Catherine Sinclair, were utterly outraged. They had spent years maneuvering their daughters and sisters into the king's orbit, waiting for the mourning period to end, so a new Luna could be crowned. Now their ambitions were being thwarted by a rejected, lie-scented Omega from the southern marshlands. "It is a temporary madness," Lord Jonathan Bradley, the Master of Coin, whispered to Lady Catherine during a council meeting. "The king is desperate. Once the pups inevitably revert to their feral state, he will see this peasant for what she is, a fluke." But Maeve was no fluke, and she refused to play the part of a highborn lady. When the royal dressmakers arrived with armfuls of imported silk and heavily embroidered corsets, Maeve politely but firmly sent them away. She knew exactly why her presence calmed the twins. They didn't need a fragile, perfumed porcelain doll. They needed an anchor. She requested simple, sturdy cotton dresses in deep forest greens and browns. Instead of sitting idle in the nursery, she kept her hands busy. She brought a small spinning wheel into the boys' room. When the atmospheric pressure dropped and the pups' wolves began to pace beneath their skin, she didn't coddle them or offer them dangerous sleeping draughts. She handed them thick bundles of raw sheep's wool and taught them how to comb it. The repetitive tactile motion of carding the wool, combined with the sharp rhythmic whir of the spinning wheel, grounded them. Maeve filled their rooms with the scent of dried eucalyptus, cedarwood, and rain-soaked earth. Slowly, miraculously, the feral wall surrounding the young princes began to crack. 3 weeks into Maeve's tenure, Arthur spoke his first word. He had been sitting on the rug attempting to untangle a particularly stubborn knot of wool when he grew frustrated. His eyes flashed amber, a warning growl vibrating in his small chest. Maeve didn't flinch. She simply reached out, placing her bare, uncalloused hand over his. "Patience, little wolf," she murmured, her voice a steady, low hum. "The knot won't yield to anger. It yields to time." Arthur blinked, the amber fading from his eyes. He looked up at her, his small brow furrowed. "Time." He echoed his voice, raspy from years of disuse. King Cedric, who had been observing from the open doorway, felt his knees nearly buckle. He had stood in the shadows for weeks, watching this strange, quiet woman work a miracle he thought impossible. As the pups healed, Cedric found himself inexplicably drawn to the nursery. He began taking his meals there, abandoning the grand, lonely dining hall. At first, the tension between the Alpha King and the Omega Maid was palpable. Maeve was terrified of him, hyper-aware of his massive, dominating presence and the dark, bruised aura of his grief. But Cedric did not demand submission. He watched her. He noticed how her sharp, earthy scent cut through the heavy metallic smell of his own anxiety. He noticed the way her hands, rough from years of labor, were infinitely gentle when she brushed Leon's hair. One evening, after the boys had finally fallen asleep, Cedric lingered by the hearth. Maeve was quietly sweeping the floor, keeping her distance. "You do not fear them," Cedric said suddenly, his deep baritone breaking the silence. Maeve paused, resting her hands on the broom handle. "They are children, Your Grace. There is nothing to fear in a child who is only asking for the dark to be turned off." Cedric stepped closer, the firelight catching the silver scars across his jaw. "And me, Maeve. Do you fear me?" Maeve looked up, meeting the Alpha King's intense, storm-grey eyes for the first time. The sheer power radiating from him made her Omega instincts hum, not with terror, but with a strange, magnetic pull. "I fear a king's power," she answered honestly. "But I do not fear the wolf hiding behind it. He is just as tired as his sons." The air between them crackled. In that breathless moment, Cedric's wolf, dormant and silent for 3 agonizing years, stirred, lifting its head and howling into the hollow cavern of his soul. It was the faint, undeniable spark of a mate bond. It wasn't the sudden, magical snap spoken of in fairy tales. It was a slow, deliberate ignition, a fire built on mutual respect and shared healing. But outside the nursery doors, a different kind of fire was brewing. Lady Catherine Sinclair, realizing that the king was slipping further from her grasp, convened a secret meeting in the castle's undercroft. Beside her stood Duke Montgomery, his face twisted in a vicious sneer. "The winter solstice gala is in 3 days," Catherine hissed, sliding a small lead-lined vial across the wooden table. "The entire Northern Territory will be present. The king plans to formally introduce his heirs with her, standing by his side." Montgomery picked up the vial, liquid nightshade heavily refined, odorless to a human but a wolf's palate. "It will be masked," Catherine interrupted, her eyes gleaming with malice. "The kitchens are preparing a heavily spiced mulled wine for the high table, cinnamon clove and star anise. It will completely overwhelm the senses. We slip this into the Omega's goblet. When she collapses, foaming at the mouth, the pups will smell the poison and panic. They will shift. They will tear the gala apart in their feral state. The visiting alphas will demand they be put down, and the king will be forced to see that the peasant maid was a temporary band-aid on a mortal wound." "And if she survives?" Montgomery asked. Catherine smiled coldly. "An Omega, without a pack, accused of inciting the royal heirs to violence, the king will have no choice but to execute her himself. The winter solstice gala transformed Ethelgard Keep into a spectacle of ice and fire. Massive crystal chandeliers cast fractured diamond-like light across the great hall. The air was thick with the suffocatingly sweet perfumes of high-born wolves, the roasted meats from the kitchens, and the rich, heavy spices of the flowing wine. For the first time in her life, Maeve was not scrubbing the floors beneath the noble's boots. She was seated at the high table, situated directly to the right of King Cedric. She wore a simple, elegant gown of deep emerald velvet, her auburn hair braided with silver threads. She felt entirely out of place, her skin prickling under the hostile, predatory stares of the aristocracy. On her left sat Arthur and Leon. They were dressed in miniature royal tunics, their eyes wide, taking in the massive crowd. They were tense, but they were holding on. Maeve kept one hand firmly resting on the bench between them, a silent, grounding anchor. "You look beautiful," Cedric murmured, leaning in close so only she could hear. His arm brushed hers, sending a jolt of electricity straight to her core. Before Maeve could reply, Duke Montgomery stepped forward, raising a massive jeweled goblet. "To the Alpha King!" Montgomery boomed, his voice echoing over the chattering crowd. "And to the miraculous recovery of the royal heirs, may the Ironwood Pack remain strong, unbroken, and pure." The hall erupted in a cheer. Servants moved swiftly along the high table, pouring the steaming, heavily spiced mulled wine into the royal goblets. Maeve reached for her silver cup. The steam rising from the liquid was overwhelmingly strong, carrying the sharp bite of clove and the heavy sweetness of cinnamon. To any ordinary wolf it smelled like a winter festival. But Maeve's Omega biology was different. She had survived her entire life by smelling the damp rot beneath the forest floor, by sensing the invisible shift in the atmosphere before a storm. As she lifted the goblet to her lips, a microscopic anomaly pierced through the heavy spices. It was a faint, metallic coldness. It smelled like dead, bruised earth. It smelled like the shadow of a grave. Nightshade. Maeve's heart slammed against her ribs. She glanced up, catching Lady Catherine Sinclair's eyes from across the room. The noblewoman's gaze was fixated on Maeve's goblet, her lips parted in eager anticipation. In a fraction of a second, Maeve realized the trap. If she drank it, She would die, leaving the pups defenseless. If she simply refused it, Catherine would find another way, perhaps targeting the boys next. There was no time for political maneuvering. There was only the pack. With a sudden violent motion that shocked the entire hall, Maeve didn't drop her goblet. Tar stood up and hurled the silver cup directly at the stone hearth. Crash! The heavy silver shattered the silence. The spiced wine hissed violently as it hit the open flames, emitting a strange, acrid blue smoke that confirmed her terrifying suspicion. The great hall plunged into a dead, horrifying silence. A scullery maid had just desecrated a royal toast. Duke Montgomery seized the moment, stepping forward with feigned outrage. "Treason! The Omega dares to insult the king's hospitality. Guard, seize her." 2 heavily armored Alpha guards rushed the high table. They never made it. A deafening, earth-shattering roar ripped through the hall. It wasn't the king. Arthur and Leon had vaulted over the table, but they hadn't shifted into the mindless, feral monsters the court remembered. They stood in front of Maeve in partial shift, their claws extended, fangs bared amber eyes, glowing with absolute, terrifying clarity. They were perfectly controlled, perfectly lethal, and entirely synchronized. They were defending their mother. "Do not touch her," Arthur growled, his childish voice distorted by the gravelly timbre of his alpha wolf. The entire hall froze. The mad princes were not mad. They were commanding the room. Before the guards could retreat, King Cedric rose from his throne. The sheer, suffocating pressure of his alpha aura slammed into the room like a physical shockwave. Nobles fell to their knees, gasping for air. The king's eyes were entirely pitch black. He looked at the blue smoke hissing in the hearth, his acute senses finally isolating the faint, deadly scent hidden beneath the spices. He turned his terrifying gaze to Duke Montgomery and Lady Catherine, who were now trembling uncontrollably. "Nightshade." Cedric's voice was a lethal whisper that carried to every corner of the room. "You dared to bring poison to my table. You dared to target my heir's protector." "My king, it was her!" Catherine shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at Maeve. "She is a witch! She has enchanted the boys." Cedric didn't even blink. "Commander Duncan," he commanded, "take the Duke and Lady Catherine to the dungeons. If they survive the interrogation, they will be stripped of their lands and banished to the Deadlands by dawn." As the screaming nobles were dragged away, the suffocating alpha pressure in the room slowly dissipated. The crowd remained on their knees, terrified to move. Cedric turned back to the high table. He looked at his sons, who slowly retracted their claws, looking back at their father with pride rather than fear. Then Cedric looked at Maeve. She was trembling, the adrenaline crashing through her system, but she stood tall, her chin raised. Cedric didn't care about the watching nobles. He didn't care about the rules of hierarchy. He walked around the table, falling to one knee before the scullery maid who had saved his family. He took her raw, lye-stained hands in his massive scarred ones and pressed them to his lips. "You are no maid, Maeve Gallagher." The Alpha King declared, his voice ringing with absolute devotion. "You are the heart of this pack. You are the calm in our storm." As he looked up into her eyes, the mate bond fully snapped into place, a brilliant, blinding tether of light that connected their souls. The entire pack felt the shift in the air, the undeniable resonance of a true Luna being recognized by her alpha. Maeve smiled, the scent of fresh rain and blooming rosemary filling the great hall, washing away the stench of treason and grief forever. She squeezed the king's hands. "Then let us weather the storm together, my king." Maeve proved that true strength isn't found in a royal bloodline or a vicious bite, but in the courage to heal a broken family. Did you love how King Cedric defended his true Luna and their pups? If this epic werewolf romance had you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button, share it with your pack, and subscribe for more thrilling stories. Tell us in the comments what was your favorite twist.